Good afternoon. I'm still reporting on the con again. The Constitutional Convention thing, also known as the Convention of States, just will not go away, despite the fact that this is nothing but a communist gambit aimed at the very heart of what makes the United States special among the nations of the world. I've been reporting on this issue since 1985. That's 40 years ago, a full 11 years before I directed the Money Masters in 1996 and started pushing hard on monetary reform. Here is the key nugget of information that you should explore in depth before you stick your neck out to support this risky convention of the states gambit. Despite lots of assertions to the contrary, the convention cannot be held to a single issue. It will become a runaway convention. Congress will be in complete control of the convention once convened. They even can change the basic rules laid out in Article 5 of our current Constitution. This is exactly what happened. This is exactly what Congress did in 1787. Their mission was to modify the existing U.S. Constitution, named the Articles of Confederation, which had existed from 1781 to 1789. Instead, Congress tossed out the Articles and started fresh. That set a legal precedent for what direction a new convention can take. Unfortunately, Congress today is not populated with well-meaning statesmen of the caliber that existed in the late 1700s. It is heavily influenced by big money lobbyists. How much lobbyist money do you think would be offered to eliminate our Second Amendment, how much lobbyist money do you think would be offered to eliminate our Second Amendment, which protects our right to own guns? The CCP would certainly start the bidding at billions of dollars towards that effort. In the last decade, several states have seen this problem and have with in the last decade, several states have seen this problem and have withdrawn earlier con calls in the hopes of preventing the possibility of a runaway convention. They insist that they can hold the convention to a single issue, however. To some states, that has meant term limits for Congress. Others have passed con calls for a balanced budget amendment. 20 states have issued con calls for a right to life amendment. So much for the single issue. The truth is that we are lucky to have the Constitution which we currently have, along with the Bill of Rights, which which have made this the most which has which have made this country the most free sovereign nation in history. To open the door to wholesale change in this current hyper-divisive environment would be suicidal. Constitutional scholars down through the years have raised the alarm of opening the entire document up to wholesale change once again. And no, despite the protestations of con advocates who have inserted drastic prohibitions into fresh con calls, such as demanding criminal penalties for those considering the passage of more than one amendment, legal scholars generally believe the risks far outweigh the advantages of a new constitutional convention. There are literally hundreds of quotes that could be used, but here are just a few. Former Chief Justice of the United States, Former Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, Warren Burger, believed that no one can limit a con once convened. In a January 30th, 1987 speech in Detroit, he said, "There is no way to put a muzzle on a constitutional convention." Former Secretary of Defense Melvin Laird was so concerned he wrote an article in the Washington Post in which he outlined the dangers of a con. There is no certainty that our nation would survive a modern day convention with its basic structures intact and its citizens' traditional rights retained. The convening of a federal constitutional convention would be an act of the greatest magnitude for our nation. I believe it would be an act fraught with danger and recklessness. There is little or no historical or constitutional guidance as to its proper powers and scope. Those who think a con could be restricted to just one issue would do well to consider Secretary Laird's analysis. The only precedent we have for a constitutional convention took place in Philadelphia in 1787. That convention, it must be remembered, broke every legal restraint designed to limit its power and agenda. The dean of the William and Mary Law School, former U.S. Senator William B. Spong, Jr., wrote in 1987, "It is doubtful that a modern-day convention could be limited to a single issue. There is no guarantee that once the delegates are convened, Pandora's box would not be opened by groups concerned with a single issue or special interest, placing at risk all of the language of our Constitution, including the Bill of Rights." Can you imagine the chaos that would ensue under our current conditions when right after Can you imagine the chaos that would ensue under our current conditions when night after night news channels would track the endless debates on this one issue? The parade of drones in the night skies would shrink to insignificance. We can even go back in history to the father of our present Constitution, James Madison. In a private letter written to George Lee Tuberville on November 2nd, 1788, Madison wrote that if another constitutional convention were held, it would be courted by the most violent partisans on both sides. It would no doubt contain individuals of insidious views who might have a dangerous opportunity of sapping the very foundations of the fabric. Having witnessed the difficulties and dangers experienced by the first convention, I should tremble for the result of a second meeting. The con idea sprang up again in 1913 as President Woodrow Wilson was implementing the Federal Reserve System, which would eventually enslave this nation in debt. Wilson's closest advisor, Colonel Edward House, advised the president that the existing Constitution was the product of 18th century minds and should be scrapped and rewritten. Fortunately, that did not happen. In 1947, two prominent Council on Foreign Relations members, Norman Cousins and James P. Warburg, formed something called the United World Federalists to try to merge the U.S. into the United Nations. Ronald Reagan was associated with the United World Federalists before he became a conservative in the early 1960s. This group actually got 27 state legislatures to pass resolutions demanding a con to expedite and ensure U.S. participation in a world government. By the end of 1950, however, most states had repealed the resolutions once the consequences of a con became clear to that generation. In 1954, Senator William Jenner warned that the con was not dead but only sleeping. We have operating within our We have operating within our government and we have operating within our government and political system another body representing another form of government, a bureaucratic elite which believes our Constitution a bureaucratic elite which believes our Constitution is outmoded. All the strange developments in foreign policy agreements we have operating within our government and political system another body representing another form of government, a bureaucratic elite which believes our Constitution is outmoded. All the strange developments in foreign policy agreements may be traced to this group who are going to make us over to suit their pleasure. In 1974, the same year President Nixon resigned, Rexford Guy Tugwell, one of the academic liberals from the old FDR brain trust of the 1930s, published a book called The Emerging Constitution. It claimed that our Constitution was too cumbersome and needed drastic change. It proposed something called a Constitution for the New States of America. The new states constitution proposed to replace the 50 states with between 10 and 20 regional new states, which would not be states at all, but rather subservient departments of the national government. Shockingly, the federal government would be empowered to abridge freedom of expression, communication, movement, and assembly in a declared emergency. In other words, the Bill of Rights would be discarded. In addition, private gun ownership would be prohibited. The bearing of arms or the possession of lethal weapons shall be confined to the police members shall be confined to the police, members of the armed forces, and those licensed under law. Freedom of religion would no longer be considered a right, but a revocable privilege. Freedom of religion would no longer be considered a right, but a revocable privilege. In addition, the new state's constitution would give the president of the new states of America a 9-year term and allow him to appoint most of the 100 senators to lifetime terms. The House of Representatives would have 100 members elected at large as a single ticket with the president and vice president for 9-year terms. In the 1970s, the Ford Foundation spent $25 million over 10 years to produce and promote the new state's constitution. In late, ni- in late 1975, something called the World Affairs Council sponsored the preparation of yet another document called a Declaration of Interdependence, written by Council of Foreign Relations member Henry Steele Commager. It was meant to replace the Declaration of Independence in time for its 200th birthday at a ceremony in Philadelphia in 1976. It included the following: 2 centuries ago, our forefathers brought forth a new nation. Now we must join with others to bring forth a new world order, to establish a new world order of compassion, peace, and justice. To establish a new world order of compassion, peace, justice, and security, it is essential that mankind free itself from the limitations of national prejudice and acknowledge that all people are part of one global community. we call upon all nations to strengthen and to sustain the United Nations and its specialized agencies and other institutions of world order, that we may preside over a reign of law that will not only end wars, but end as well that mindless violence which terrorizes our society even in times of peace. This was signed by more than 100 U.S. senators and congressmen. After the Declaration of Interdependence became the subject of controversy, many of the legislators withdrew their support. The error in logic, though, is subtle and worth repeating. As predicted in biblical prophecy, once the power vested in nations is transferred to a single world authority, we can be sure that the reign of the Antichrist will begin. Without a system of checks and balances, no earthly authority is corruption proof. Since 1975, as many as 40 draft versions of the revised Constitution have been prepared. By 1984, a more toned down version was presented to a group known as the Committee on the Constitutional System, CCS. This has been the group anticipating the result of This has been the group anticipating the results of the Con Drive, which has been spearheaded with by by the National Taxpayers Association since 1980. The CCS proposal includes the following: permit the president to dissolve Congress when he thinks Congress is intractable and call for new congressional elections. Eliminate the 22nd Amendment, which limits the president to 2 terms. Reduce the cost of presidential and congressional elections by holding them at regular intervals so that the date would not be known. Reduce the cost of presidential and congressional elections by holding them at irregular intervals so that the date would not be known very far in advance, similar to the British parliamentary system. The true intentions of this group, however, may be revealed by one of its board members, James McGregor Burns, a professor and historian, who in 1984 wrote the following analysis of the situation for CCS members. Let's face reality. The framers of the Constitution have simply been too shrewd for us. They have outwitted us. They designed separate institutions that cannot be unified by mechanical linkages, frail bridges, or tinkering. If we are to turn the founders upside down, we must directly confront the constitutional structures they erected. Henry Hazlitt, a chief con proponent and advisor to the National Taxpayers Union, addresses this vexing problem in his 19 this vexing problem in his addresses this vexing problem in his 1974 book, A New Constitution Now. The very minimum change necessary if our Constitution is to have any real flexibility the very minimum change necessary if our Constitution is to have any real flexibility is a change from our present method of constitutional amendment itself. Conceivably, Congress could frame a lengthy amendment providing for a parliamentary form of government and submit it to the state legislatures or to conventions in the present prescribed manner. But the advantages of approaching this goal by 2 or more steps rather than by one seem to me of determining importance. Fast forward to the present day. Opening the entire Constitution to wholesale change, which is a possibility, is way too risky, especially since there is an excellent alternative in Article 6 of the existing Constitution. Rather than trying to rein in big government by altering the Constitution with Article 5, citizens and lawmakers should be reining in big government by enforcing the Constitution with Article 6. Article 6 states that only those laws that are made in pursuance of the Constitution shall be the supreme law of the land. This is what is known as the Supremacy Clause. In other words, any laws passed by Congress that are not made in accordance with the Constitution are not the supreme law of the land, rendering them invalid. Why do we never hear about this? Whenever the federal government passes unconstitutional acts, it is up to the states to intervene and defend the Constitution. State and local officials, in keeping with their oath to the Constitution, are to ignore such acts and only enforce those that are actually made in pursuance of the Constitution. To ensure that Article 6 is applied, elected officials must be held accountable by we the people. They must take their oath of office seriously and abide by it. If they do not, the electorate has a duty to replace them. So let's protect this God-given framework. Of freedom, our Constitution, at all costs, but replace the state level officials who are not protecting the Constitution as per their oath of office, a much safer and swifter remedy. For more quotes of notable constitutional experts, Attorney Mark Bork assembled an excellent video for state legislators 16 years ago. Here is the link to that presentation. I'm still reporting from just outside the citadel of world freedom. Good day.